Cloud.
Okay, so that was you, and this is me.
There we go. And I've got a little bit of an intro to do here.
Okay.
All right, welcome back to the Contrarians. Tonight we have a very special, very flannel-clad episode. Grunge, as hopefully you know, is a synonym for dirt or grime. But when you talk about grunge music, we're talking about the music of Generation X, the music that came from Seattle in the late 80s and early 90s. For most, I guess the term now the kids are using is normies, although I hate that term. Grunge came kind of fully formed in 1991 when Nevermind suddenly hit public consciousness, although grunge had actually been around considerably longer than that. The earliest reference that I could find to the term grunge as it related to music was from Bruce Pavitt, the co-founder of Sub Pop Records, and it was when he was trying to promote Green River's Dry as a Bone EP, and he called it ultra loose grunge that destroyed the morals of a generation, which, by the way, it didn't, although it may have had that effect on Green River themselves. That might be a topic for a different show. Also, in a 1988 magazine article, he wrote that this year, Sub Pop introduces the world to the Seattle grunge rock sound, although that didn't really happen for another 3 years. He was apparently an optimist, old Mr. Pavitt. So it's now been more than 30 years since grunge came to public consciousness, and it's high time that we had a conversation. Tonight, we're going to talk about who invented grunge. I've been looking forward to this one. I've got my flannel on. I haven't put on my flannel in years because I live in Texas and it's really hot. So, guys, let's hear it. Let's start with John the Music Nut. John, who do you think invented grunge?
Thank you, Reed. Thank you, Martin, for having me on. I live in Pennsylvania. I should have put my flannel on. So, in my opinion, I believe that this band invented grunge. The Velvet Underground with White Light, White Heat. Now, this was their second album, and they kind of hinted at grunge a little bit on their debut, The Velvet Underground with Nico, particularly on the song European Sun. But when they put out White Light, White Heat in 1968, they made probably the noisiest record that would have been released that year. And outside of one song on here called Here She Comes Now, which is 2 minutes and 2 seconds, the rest of this album is a very hard hitting, very loud, very noisy album with great, all the songs are great. It's an album I've loved for many, many years. I'd give it a 10 out of 10. But particularly on Sister Ray, which is a over 17-minute song, which it just takes on a life of its own. It just becomes its long guitar jam, but they're going in all different directions, going very avant-garde. The Velvet Underground, particularly Lou Reed and John Cale, were big fans of Ornette Coleman, the free jazz saxophonist who had a fantastic career. And there's a lot of Ornette Coleman in the jams on that song. To me, this is the band that should get the credit. But in the 90s, the band that got the credit most of the time was a band that put out an album a few months later, and that was Neil Young and Crazy Horse, what everybody knows as Nowhere. And I believe the reason Neil gets more of the credit is because he kept going back to this sound. He would make acoustic albums, and then he would go back to grunge again, but they didn't have a name for it. Like on 1979's Rust Never Sleeps. That has more of a grunge sound with Hey, Hey, My, and Powderfinger and songs like that. And then in the 80s, he went through told he would do different genres in every album. He was genre jumping big time, going all over the place. And in 1990, he gets Crazy Horse back together and they do Ragged Glory. So 1990s, right before Pearl Jam 10 comes out, and Nirvana's Nevermind comes out, and Soundgarden's Bad Motorfinger comes out. So because this album was successful, they were getting more of the credit because again, Neil was going back to that sound. But I also think if you even go farther back before Lou Reed and John Cale and the Velvet Underground and Neil Young and Crazy Horse, you heard a little bit of it in garage rock. When I hear songs like Psychotic Reaction by the Count Five, Push It Too Hard by the Seeds, You're Gonna Miss Me by 13th Floor Elevators, I hear some grunge in there. You know, because you got those loud, very distorted guitars, and they're very spirited performances. The songs aren't really complicated, you know. They just cut to the chase, 3-4 chords, and they knock you out. But to me, it's the Velvet Underground.
Wow.
Okay. Well, one of my theories is sounding a lot less insane, but we're going to get back to that in a few minutes. Thank you very much, John. I love it. We're off to a good start.
Thank
Martin,
you.
Banger Films did a show on grunge, right? Were you involved in that at all?
I was absolutely involved in that. And I just went from 0 to 100 miles an hour on this. So let me explain here. So I could probably go on for an hour, but I'm going to keep this a little short, but it's probably going to be a little longer than what John just did. So I love what John did, but the hilarious thing is, and that's all correct stuff and good stuff, but it's not where I go with this at all. So here's why I'm going to go from 0 to 100. So yes, we did the Metal Evolution series, and we did an entire episode on grunge, okay? So we went all fully into this Who Invented Grunge thing. Now, remember that I've done a book called Who Invented Heavy Metal. I want to do a book called Who Invented Punk, and I kind of started that. And I also started a book called Who Invented Grunge. And I thought I wasn't going to be very prepared here. And I went and found this article I did for Goldmine, top 20 albums that invented grunge, and I was just going to talk about that. But I actually found my detailed timeline of the invention of grunge, and I want to quote from it a little. But to start with, I want to add to John's thing and almost give a whole nother part of it that he didn't even bring up, because to me, my one sentence answer about who invented grunge is classic heavy metal mixed with punk. Okay. Now the garage rock thing is important, and Velvet Underground's important. And I'm gonna add to the garage rock thing here as well. But Psych and the Nuggets thing. So moving from garage rock into Psych. But to me, how I've always grown up thinking about grunge, to me, the first great grunge document, the actual grunge document, is the Green River album, Rehab Doll, and maybe the Mudhoney first EP, Super Fuzz Big Muff, right? Although, interestingly enough, Green River had an earlier EP, and actually their first EP is fully grunge as well. So it goes first EP, 1984, not so grunge. Next EP, totally grunge. Album, absolute grunge classic, Rehab Doll, right? And we know members from that band, moved over, and we got Mudhoney and Pearl Jam out of it and all that sort of thing. But yeah, so I'll start with my umbrella answer. My umbrella answer is if I had to pick, the main things that went into it, I would say Aerosmith and Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath. And then the grunge guys will always tell you, because they're too cool to ever cite metal influences, so they never did that, right? So they would cite punk influences, right? But the interesting thing about the punk influences I find that actually show up in grunge, it's less so standard original punk from 76, 77, 78, and more so a mix of hardcore punk moving over to American punk. So your Black Flag type punk, Black Flag and Minutemen and things like that, but also post-punk. You definitely get a post-punk vibe in grunge too, in the dissonance, the breaking of rules, the open spaces, the gnarly bass guitar, and just deconstructed things. So my number one anchor, I think, is good old 70s, boogie hard rock, doomy hard rock, all the hard rock from the 70s. Ted Nugent, Blue Oyster Cult, all of that stuff, but a lot of Sabbath and a lot of Zeppelin. Now to just, I'm going to rattle through this as quick as I can, but so I found my seed of this book. And in the 50s, I have, I put this in the heavy metal one as well. I think the first heavy metal song is Johnny Burnett and the Rock and Roll Trio, Train Kept a Rollin'. 1958, Ventures. 63, Kingsman, Louie Louie. Sonics, The Witch. Kinks, You Really Got Me. Kinks All Day and All the Night. More Kinks. The Rolling Stones, I Can't Get No Satisfaction. More Sonics, Here Are the Sonics. A quote from DMZ, Mono Man, Jeff Connolly. There's a lost classic, 1978, that people forget is kind of a grunge album from 1978, DMZ. Check it out, from Boston. He went on to do The Liars. The Who, Blue Cheer, Yardbirds, The Seeds, 13th Floor Elevators, as John mentioned. Are You Experienced? Blue Cheer. MC5, huge. MC5 and Stooges is a real building block, because that's a synthesis of heavy metal and garage rock and punk, proto punk. So really a lot of what you're hearing in that early grunge is, if you wanted to be really direct about it, it's almost like an update of MC5 and the Stooges, right? So moving into 70s, I hope I have, there's a whole neat story about the first uses of that word as well. But so moving into 1970, Black Sabbath Funhouse, Paranoid, Zeppelin 3, more Black Sabbath. Aerosmith is super important. Aerosmith, you can hear that in Alice in Chains. You can hear that in Mother Love Bone. Let's see, Ramones, super important. Sex Pistols, but again, I don't hear these bands a lot in grunge. Let's see, 1979, both Husker Du and the Replacements formed. So the Minneapolis sound, super important, because that's 5 years before grunge. Essentially, you get Replacements, Minutemen, Soul Asylum, right? Did I say Husker Du? Anyways, yeah, Fire Hose is in there as well eventually. Let's see. Bundle of Hiss, Kurt Danielson, Andrew Wood, Mother Love Bone forms Malfunction. Meat Puppets is important. Fastbacks. So Seattle also has kind of an anemic, crappy, not great, overrated punk scene. And grunge also owes a lot of debt to Seattle's own punk scene, right? And it's a late punk scene. They don't really have much going, at punk's genesis time. But so 82, let's see, Kim Thalen, Hiro Yamamoto, Move, Husker Du's first album, Bruce Pavitt issues Sub Pop #5 cassette, Meat Puppets, Replacements. 83, Soul Asylum, Husker Du Replacements, more Husker Du. I haven't filled in everything, but this was me starting, right? So there's what happens when I do these timelines is I'll often focus on a band and put them right through. So that's why there's too much of some bands and not much mention of other things. January 85, Jack Endino and Daniel House formed Skinyard. CZ Records is formed. CZ Records, 1985. U-Men. So this is so Skinyard play their first show in 85. Husker Du. Green River's Come On Down EP. 1985. So there's your first EP. It's on Homestead Records. So it's not really perfectly grunge that way. Steve Albini, Big Black in 86. Denver's The Fluid, issue a debut, Punch and Judy, 86. Vancouver, Slow, Sons of Freedom, important ones. Melvins are coming along. Here's a key record in the invention of grunge, the Deep Six compilation, March 1986. Z Records, you get Green River, Melvins, Malfunction, Skinyard, Soundgarden, U-Men. So 86. Basically, a lot of people, and I remember doing this in that episode, a lot of people consider that the first grunge album. And it's cool. It's like a Metal Massacre situation where you get this nice survey. It's like New Wave British Heavy Metal comps, right? Afghan Wigs, we get the Sub Pop 100 compilation in July of 86. Part 4, I guess I called Answer, We Are Grunge. Okay, so I guess I was doing the Devo title here, right? So part 4, 1987, I guess I'm calling the birth of grunge, right? Big Black, Meat Puppets, Melvin, Swallow, Babes in Toyland. Bruce Pavitt puts the term grunge to widespread use in describing a Green River, whose lead singer, Mark Arm, is credited with the first. Yeah, so Mark Arm wrote some review somewhere and he said grunge, believe it or not. I think that's how that works. placements. Guns N' Roses, Appetite for Destruction matters. I think Alice in Chains, 87, 88, Alice in Chains demo, Blood Circus, The Fluid, Sons of Freedom issued their seminal proto-grunge classic, their self-titled amazing album. I also think a thing in the invention of grunge is that period in California, LA, where you do get the Minutemen, Faith No More, Jane's Addiction, that kind of stuff. So that's like that's the birth of alternative metal, hard rock. So that's important as well. Tad, Billy Corrigan, yeah, Smashing Pumpkins are forming, Mudhoney's groundbreaking grungy Touch Me I'm Sick single, Soundgarden's Fop EP 88, and on and on. So Super Fuzz Big Muff is 88, Soundgarden's debut album is 88. So to me, everybody's got it all together. There's not a lot of music yet. In 87, 88, you get your first releases. The last thing I'll say is, going to that article I did for Goldmine, I thought I made a pretty good case for, definitely DOA, so Vancouver. So anything close by, like super important punk band from Vancouver, right? But a late punk band. So they're an 80, 81 kind of punk band. Black Flag, like I say, super important. The one I wanted to make a point of including is The Cult. So I think with The Cult, you get a synthesis of alternative rocks. You get the goth, you get the heavy metal riffs. So I think by the time you get to Love and Electric, I think there's an influence there that's sort of important. There's this extra path besides hair metal being pointed forward towards an alternative metal sort of thing, which is picked up by Faith No More and those kinds of bands as well. Wow, yeah. So like I say, that's a lot. That's my treatise on where this all comes from.
Wow, that is a compressed treatise, to be sure. I think hardcore grunge aficionados would say that Green River is probably the seminal band. They're kind of the seed from which, everything splits off in 1988, but that's a little too easy. So what I'm going to propose is three, like one think piece, one kind of serious discussion point, and then one let's just consider a contrarian point, because this channel is the freaking Contrarians and I'm me. So let's do the think piece first, because I'm going to introduce a band. And Martin, I'm so glad that you brought up The Cult there at the end, because The Cult was right in there. I love your phrase, like a dirty shirt. I don't know where that came from, but I've been using that ever since I first heard you use that on a video. So The Cult was right in there like a dirty shirt. 1988, they were all over the radio, Firewoman and all those great songs. And that wasn't really a grunge sound, but they were definitely in there and influenced by a band that I am going to offer as somebody else that may have been a proto-grunge band. So I want you to, this is just a think piece now, but think about this with me. What if I told you that maybe grunge, think about a band that performed their concerts. Now, they had all of the elements of a grunge act. They performed their concerts in the clothes that they wore on the streets. That was the element of grunge that made grunge grungy. That was why these guys were in flannel shirts, because they lived in freaking Seattle and it was chilly and wet, and flannel shirts were just what they wore, right? So I'm talking about a band that at a time when flamboyance was just starting to hit in the rock scene, these guys were wearing street clothes when they performed. At a time when bands were singing about hedonism, they were singing about alienation, they were singing about society and the effects of society on the human psyche. A band that was known for a singer that was more of a poet, really, than a singer. He was singing poetry, perhaps more than actual song lyrics. A band that was known, sadly, this is a characteristic of grunge acts. This is not one of the better characteristics, and that's drug problems. Think of how many people in the grunge acts died from heroin. Yeah. It's a lot. That was a very bad part of the grunge scene, and it continued for years. And drug abuse was a big part of rock for a long time. And this particular singer, he flamed out in only 4 years of appearing on the world stage, taking the world by storm, being one of the most celebrated people in the world, and then flaming out and dying. And in retrospect, people kind of looked back at his work and thought, some of this looks an awful lot like a cry for help, or that maybe this guy kind of planned on maybe offing himself this whole time and we just weren't really paying attention. Somebody whose work has either been cited by some of the bands that we've already talked about as an influence, or various performers might as well be tribute acts to at least this singer, or in one case, one of the singers was even in that band. What if the Doors were the first grunge act?
Yeah, I like that. I'd put them into to some extent, definitely. Yeah. We obviously it's really all focused on Jim because the music is demented carnival music, right?
Right.
And grunge guys didn't play that kind of music. But Jim, perfectly. Yeah, you're right. You're right. The poetry, the singing, the frontman style, the look, for sure.
Ian Astbury. That's why I loved you bringing in the Cult, because Ian was eventually in the reformation or the revival of the Doors.
Doors of the 21st century, I think they were called, 20th century, something like that.
And Eddie Vedder might as well be channeling Jim Morrison. Yep. Made his whole career trying to be Jim Morrison. So, plus the Doors were, well, everybody was, but the Doors were like the American Who. They were just so loud, right? Mm-hmm. And sadly, they were also known for Jim being so wasted that he couldn't perform often.
Did Jim often have like a wine bottle with him too? On stage? I picture him, Pete Steele, and Eddie Vedder all wandering the stage with a wine bottle. I don't know if I'm right about that or if that's a Mandela effect or something, but
now that one I don't remember. I do know that there were multiple times when the band would just noodle around because Jim could barely squeeze out his own lyrics. Yeah. So anyway, just food for thought. It hit me though. I was like, I would sell that one. I don't know who's buying, but I'll sell it.
Your first one's not nutty. I think you're saving your nuttiest one for later, right?
Well, in a more realistic sense, who invented grunge? For me, I'm going to say, Jack Endino invented grunge.
Oh, yeah.
Because when you talk about grunge, so unless you were one of the people actually living in the Seattle area, and there were people, I actually lived in Seattle in 1988 for one summer, but unless you were one of the few hundred people who saw those acts live in the bars, your exposure to grunge comes entirely from their recorded output. Mm-hmm. And that means you heard Jack Endino until Soundgarden and Nirvana and eventually Pearl Jam and the others got major labels. But, Jack Endino did Bleach. He did Soundgarden's first EP. I don't remember the name of it, but the man is still producing. I mean, the last credit I saw for him was in 2021. So we're talking about a guy who had the ability to produce fast and cheap. Now, it just so happened that he also appeared to have some talent, but that probably was not his selling point. Not to take anything away from him, but this is just like, it's the same situation that you had with thrash metal, where Combat and Noise and Metal Blade, they were putting out records for almost no money at all. They did not have money. What they needed was product, and they didn't have any money to spend on it. So you got this very characteristic sound. If you got an album on Metal Blade, it had way too much treble. It always had too much treble. That was the characteristic sound of Metal Blade, right? Well, it just so happens Jack Endino had this characteristic sound, and that was the sound that these grunge bands wanted. They wanted distortion. They wanted fuzz. They wanted lots of feedback, and Endino liked that. And it was this weird serendipity that he was the right producer working cheap in Seattle at the right time. And with a different person in that place producing those records, who knows what would have happened. And, you know, if you saw them live, of course, live, all they did was get up on stage, crank their amplifiers up to maximum. You couldn't hear a word the singer was saying. You know, they're just, everything's on maximum volume and screaming at the top of their lungs and too much feedback. And everybody was high as a kite. And speaking of which, the fact that Jack and Endino could take these bands, and we're talking about brand new bands. These guys are young, they're inexperienced, and they are stoned out of their minds. And he was able to produce music with them. That in and of itself is a talent. So that guy has my utmost respect.
Yeah.
So without Jack and Endino, grunge would not have happened. Did he invent it? No, but without him, it wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, I think you basically got a bunch of small bands, and then he was like a you know, a unifying force there. You also have the Charles Peterson photography aesthetic. You get this strong hip label in Sub Pop that everybody's kind of recording for. I just wanted to mention, I mean, I was living in Vancouver when that all happened, and it was a magic time for me. I just loved walking in and finding that stuff in our Hip Zulu records there. And I saw Mudhoney live in '88. And I swear it was one of the greatest shows I've ever seen. It was just the sound was amazing. It was quite loud, but it was gorgeously, you know, rendered. And it was like controlled chaos. Those guys were good musicians, but they were playing this. What I love about grunge is it reminds me of like lightning in a bottle. It's almost like this controlled mayhem. It definitely felt heavier than hair metal because you know, although it was lacking some of the things that would make hair metal heavy, like great guitar solos and things like that, and big sounds, big production. It definitely, there was a reason the wholesale industry moved over to it, because it was so valid and all that. But even if you were a metalhead, you moved over to it because it actually sounded really heavy. Right. I mean, it was just dangerous and scary. You didn't know where a song was going to go. I mean, the Screaming Life EP is a perfect example of that. Right. It's just one song to the next. That's where I think, again, you can bring in that post-punk influence. There's definitely a post-punk thing into it about breaking rules. But I'll stop there. I don't know, John, do you have anything else to add?
Well, count me as one of those metalheads who jumped into grunge when it started to really take hold. And I mean, when you look at society at the time too, grunge had to happen because things were getting stale, and it was emblematic of our society at that time. We were going to war in Iraq here in the United States. People weren't going to concerts as much at that time. The industry had gone down because people didn't have as much money because the economy wasn't as good. We wanted something that was more real rather than something like nothing but a good time, a party all the time. Well, as the 90s came, we needed a change from that. We went in the opposite direction, from the glitz and the makeup and the big hair to dress down in flannel and jeans, you know. So it was something that you saw coming with some bands. I mean, you mentioned Jane's Addiction and Faith No More. At that time, they were just coming up. They were starting to get played a lot on college rock stations, and it was just building from there. And it became a movement. And like I said, it was very emblematic of where our society was going. Reed, you made a great point about Jim Morrison, because I would have never thought of that about that. But yes, he was a star and he flamed out. And you had those big, not maybe the greatest singers in grunge, but the leaders of those bands had similar philosophies. They had these big personalities like Kurt Cobain, like Eddie Vedder, lots like Scott Weiland,
like Wood,
like Lane Staley. So they they had those big, I mean, we knew the music, but they were the focuses of the band, the focus of each respective band. And they all had, and you were talking about heroin before. You had Shannon Hoon from Blind Melon. I mean, that was not a grunge band, but same situation. A guy who was the centerpiece of that band had one huge hit, and a few years later he was gone.
Plus, they had a grunge name of the band and grunge album covers.
I
mean, they're kind of a grunge band, right? I mean, the cool thing about grunge was that they were there was no rules. A lot of things fit under the umbrella, and Blind Melon was kind of close, right?
They were,
they're close. A little more jangly, I thought.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
well,
I'm not. Yeah.
They weren't alternative enough to be alternative, but they weren't tough enough to be grunge.
Right.
So my third and kind of contrarian opinion is, of course, that no one really invented grunge. So here's the thing about grunge, right? Grunge just happened. As with most movements, it isn't a movement. The thing about any sort of musical period is that it lasts 4 to 6 years. Not coincidentally, the length that, at least in America, you're in junior high and high school. These are the years that you're most into music, right? And every 4 to 6 years, everything changes. We'd already, at least in terms of heavy music, traditional metal had already come and gone. Thrash metal was never going to be more than a sideline, although weirdly, it was just about to go mainstream and have the biggest album of the 90s, and who saw that coming? And then on the sideline, AC/DC was about to have their second explosion, and who saw that coming again? But so we had traditional metal, which when Bruce Dickinson flames out at the end of the, oh my goodness,
Maiden with Fear of the Dark.
What was the live album? They did the
Real Dead one, Real Live one,
Real Live one.
No, the one where they did. Oh my God, I can't believe that my head.
Well, Live
Power Slave.
Mm-hmm.
Live After Death.
Live After Death. Yeah, they toured that album for like 2 years, and at the end of that, Bruce was just about dead, and Maiden took a big break, and they never got that momentum back. And you can really look at that as that was the split where traditional metal kind of ceased their momentum, and thrash metal steps in, right? And that's where thrash metal becomes the dominant metal, sort of. I mean, for the hardcore guys, but really hair metal becomes the dominant metal in terms of radio success. And Bon Jovi and Poison and Motley Crue, and once you get into the late 80s, Def Leppard are the dominant radio bands. But now we're into 91. Those guys are winding down. They've had 5 years at the top. It is simply time for the next big thing. And here is grunge. And again, grunge, I'm sorry, it's not that grunge is not a great form of music. Grunge, I loved grunge. Like Martin keeps saying, grunge was heavy music, man. It was full of guitars. It was this, I keep saying, grunge was the 70s and the 90s. It was heavy riffs. It was great singing. It was great musicianship. But grunge was cheap. And the labels had money to spend. How much do you think Nirvana cost a major label to buy? Nothing. They cost nothing for a major label to buy. And they went out and they shoved it down kids' throats and they made $1 billion on it. Grunge was cheap and they were able to just push that and make a lot of money. And then they looked at that and went, hey, I wonder what else is sitting out there in Seattle. Oh, Soundgarden? Well, actually, Soundgarden was already on a major label, but you know, Bad Motorfinger didn't sell a lot of copies. Super Unknown sold a lot of copies because it got a much bigger marketing push. You know, Alice in Chains, their first album or Facelift didn't sell a lot of copies, but Dirt sold a lot of copies, right? Because it had a lot more power behind it. Pearl Jam 10 sold 1 billion copies. So, I mean, it was always big. But, you know, what was huge at the same time was Thunderstruck. AC/DC's Razor's Edge, which actually I think is a pretty lame album, but I think Thunderstruck's a great song. But I remember AC/DC was the first $40 concert to come to Oklahoma City. back in the day. I remember when ticket prices, when John was talking about how things were more expensive. I was like, $40?
Yeah.
Who would pay $40 to go see a show? And then Pearl Jam came to town and they were still $17 for a ticket.
And for the record, also huge at that time was Ozzy, Aerosmith, Metallica, Guns N' Roses, right? All of that stuff was really big at the same time too. So you still had some big metal, and then hair metal's going down, but there's still some great hair metal albums creatively coming out, 91, 92, 93.
Right.
You know, and I really I bristle when grunge people, because grunge people are snobby and they're too cool, and they're like, you know, music snobs that say, oh, there was no grunge sound, and you know, it's stupid putting a label on it. It was very convenient to put a label on it. There were a bunch of cool heavy bands that kind of looked the same. They sounded same enough, like it was just an alternative cool form of heavy metal. You know, the aesthetics of everything was kind of the same, the similar sort of lyric things. There were some trends like the short, you know, one word names of songs and things like that, right? So I think it's very tidy to put you know, to put brackets around what was happening there, and having a whole pile of it all come out of Seattle helped as well. And then everybody else had their little grunge scenes. Pod was one of my favorite grunge bands from Lawrence, Kansas, right? Love those guys. I just wanted to mention, you know, this Goldmine article I did. I just wanted to quote a few things from it that drive home some of these points of why I picked some of these albums. So I picked Stooges, and I said Iggy is the old Detroit version of Mark Arm, basically the face and voice of original grunge. Plus, the music is irreverent punk metal. So yes, everything about the Stooges stacks up as a blueprint for grunge. I really believe that about that first and second Stooges album, and even the third. Zeppelin 4, I put not a lot of Zepp's music stylings can be found in grunge. Only you have to look more to the folk, and the production. But I'd say Zepp's look and demeanor are kind of grungy. Plus, Chris Cornell howls and heroes, kind of like Robert Plant. Let's see, Aerosmith rocks. Guys who grew up on grunge most definitely love themselves some Aerosmith, BOC, Kiss, and Ted when they were pups. Plus, Heart to keep things local. Yeah, so they were very revered. I had Dead Boys on this list. DOA, I said this record might not have mattered so much had DOA not been from just up the way in Vancouver, had 1980, but 1981 is a formative time for future grunge noisenicks, even though it's late for original punk, but it was heavy and aggressive when most of the original punkers had gone artsy post-punk. Not really hardcore, nonetheless, Hardcore 81 is a bridge record to real hardcore. So there's that. Black Flag, like I say, was important. Husker Du basically sounds like a grunge band to me, or a type, right? Had they been from Seattle, they would have just said, oh, here's a slightly different flavor of grunge. It'd be the one thing they'd say doesn't sound like a Jack Endino production, I think. But Melvin's 1987 Gluey Porch Treatments I've got on here. Never's got the credit, but Kurt Cobain was sure studying what Matt Luke and Buzz Osborne, Dale Crover were up to. Melvin's represented the music snob side of grunge, the opacity sounding like a slowed down Husker Du, carrying the sludge side of grunge. Yeah, so there was a sludge element. Not quite arty like Sonic Youth. Sonic Youth's kind of important as well for this whole thing, right? Bauhaus, Joy Division, a little bit of that stuff. And yeah, so for this list, I put as the number one. You know, I mentioned the Green River, the Jane's Addiction, nothing shocking. It certainly sounds like a grunge album. It sounds like a Soundgarden album, right? That's the first studio album, right? And Mudhoney Super Fuzz Big Muff is so perfect there as well. And they were the band that were the most respectful of garage rock and psych, right, out of all these bands. And they, of course, very prolific, but never became one of the big ones. So yeah, that's I'll stop there.
All right. Yeah, so anybody watching, if you've never heard Green River, it's available easily on YouTube. Track it down. Fantastic album. Came out after they broke up. One of rock's interesting little tragedies. They became Mother Love Bone and Mudhoney, I believe, and then eventually Pearl Jam. So and Temple of the Dog.
Yeah, I don't know. Did Rehab Doll come out
after they broke up?
Really?
Yeah, they actually broke up while they were recording it.
I don't quite remember that, but yeah, I've got June 88 here. So that's interesting. Okay. So yeah. And yeah, like I say, I think I usually pick that as the first bona fide grunge full length album, right?
Yeah. And I would put Raw Power, the Stooges' Raw Power, I think would be their most grungy album, I would say, over the first two.
Sure.
but personal preference.
Cool.
All right. Anyone else? John, you want to add any last points? I think I've had more than my fair share of say
Me
tonight.
too.
So
Thanks. What was really popular about Nirvana, what they really brought back, was the soft verse, loud chorus.
That's right.
And for the rest of the decade, you had all these bands coming out that would have like one hit, and some of them would even cross over to adult contemporary charts. One soft verse, loud chorus.
But we have to bring up the Pixies, right? As a big.
I was just going to go there.
Good.
To me, thank you. To me, Kurt Cobain borrowed a lot of his sound from the Pixies, with Surferosa and Doolittle. That's exactly where I was going to go. I think I don't know if we would have had a Nirvana without the Pixies.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. Or interestingly, the Smiths. If when Nirvana appeared on Top of the Pops, Kurt Cobain was doing his best impression of John Morrissey. Duh. I don't know where I'm getting Jack Morrissey. Anyway, just Morrissey. Now people are going to be flaming me for getting Morrissey's name wrong. It's the drugs, people. Sorry. All right. So that is, what do we got? About 45 minutes of grunge. That's a lot for three old men to get through. We're going to call that a night, I think. So that's our take on the origin of grunge. Leave a note in the comments. Let us know what you think. Who invented grunge? Fascinating topic. It's high time that our people embraced grunge. Doggone it, it's the music of Generation X. I love grunge. You should love grunge. We should all love grunge. Listen to Green River. It's a fantastic album. Rehab Doll. Stupid name. Fantastic album. Yeah. And thanks for tuning into Contrarians. We'll see y'all soon.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Perfect. That was good.
That was fun.
All right. Well, thanks, Reed. I know that was tough